She was 23 and for all intents and purposes, homeless in a territory that had little use for a woman with no people and no money. After being cheated out of the laundry position she had traveled 300 miles to secure, she was left with nothing but a single silver dollar, a worn dress, and a small, heavy thimble in her pocket. On an impulse born of a deep and unfamiliar despair, she traded that last coin for a dead outlaw's battered leather pack at an estate sale where his few possessions were being sold for scrap. But what no one there knew, what the auctioneer who mocked her purchase could not see, was that something was carefully stitched into the lining, a secret that would not just change her life, but reclaim a piece of a town's wounded soul. Stay close and listen to the story of May Whitcomb. May had learned the value of a good stitch from her grandmother, Elspeth MacLeod, a woman whose hands were never still, and whose heart was the only true home May had ever known. Her parents, consumed by the slow failure of their dry goods store in eastern Nebraska, had regarded May as another mouth, another quiet disappointment. It was Elspeth who had seen the girl. She had taught May the difference between a running stitch and a backstitch, how to work a needle through thick canvas without puckering the seam, and how to read the life of a garment in its frays and patches. "Everything that's made has a story," Elspeth would say, her voice a low burr, her fingers guiding May's. "And anything that's broken can be mended, if you've the patience for it." Elspeth's hands were maps of a life spent working. Her knuckles were swollen with arthritis, but her movements were economical and sure. She taught May how to card wool and spin it into tight, even yarn, how to dye it with onion skins for gold and walnuts for a deep, rich brown. She taught her how to tan a rabbit hide until it was supple as cloth, and how to repair a boot sole with an awl and waxed thread. These were not lessons in housewifery. They were lessons in survival, passed down from a woman who had crossed an ocean with little more than the clothes on her back and the skills in her hands. May absorbed it all with a quiet intensity, her small fingers learning the language of thread and leather, of sinew and wool. Her most prized possession was the silver thimble Elspeth had given her, worn smooth and thin on one side from a lifetime of pushing needles through stubborn fabric. It was a simple, unadorned thing, but it felt like a direct connection to the only person who had ever looked at her and seen not a burden, but a promise. The thimble was heavy in her pocket, a small, cold anchor in a world that had suddenly come loose from its moorings. When Elspeth died, the winter May turned 19, the silence in her parents' house became absolute. The warmth went out of the world. May stayed for 4 more years, her labor in the failing store unacknowledged, her presence tolerated rather than cherished. She was a ghost in her own home, mending the family's clothes, cooking the meager meals, her grandmother's lessons her only company. The letter from Wyoming had felt like a miracle. A distant cousin of her mother's, a woman she'd never met, offered her a position doing laundry and mending for a small hotel in a dusty town called Redemption. The pay was modest, but it was a wage. It was a life of her own. She packed her few belongings in a carpet bag, placing the silver thimble carefully in a small cloth pouch. She said her goodbyes to her parents, who accepted her departure with the same weary indifference they applied to everything else. Her father gave her $5 silver for the journey, a transaction that felt more like a settlement than a blessing. The journey west was long and bruising. A week on a crowded train and 2 days on a jostling stagecoach. But with every mile, a fragile hope began to sprout in May's chest. She was leaving the silence behind. She was traveling toward a place where her skills would have value, where she could earn her own bread and stand on her own feet. When she finally arrived in Redemption, her back aching and her clothes coated in a fine layer of alkali dust, the hope was a palpable thing, a warmth in her throat. The hotel owner, a man named Blevins with a sweat-stained collar and shifty eyes, met her on the boardwalk. He did not offer to take her bag. He did not welcome her. He squinted at her, his gaze lingering on her worn dress, and informed her that the position had been filled. "My niece decided to take it," he said, his tone flat, offering no apology. Came down from Cheyenne last week. Family first, you understand." May understood perfectly. She understood the 300 miles she had traveled, the $4.50 she had spent on tickets, the letter in her bag that was now nothing more than a piece of paper. She felt the eyes of the town on her, a lone woman with a dusty bag and a useless promise. There was no argument to be made. The cruelty was not overt, it was administrative, a simple closing of a door in her face. She did not cry. She did not beg. The lessons of her grandmother had been about more than thread, they had been about enduring. May simply nodded, the single motion a testament to a lifetime of swallowing disappointment. She turned and walked away, the 50 cents left from her father's $5 feeling as useless as a stone in her pocket. She had 50 cents and a silver thimble. She was a stranger in a town called Redemption, with nothing left to save. That afternoon, a crowd gathered in front of the marshal's office for the auction of a dead man's effects. The man was Silas Kane, an outlaw shot dead 2 days prior during a failed robbery. His name was spoken in low, excited tones. May, adrift and with nowhere else to go, found herself on the edge of the assembly, listening to the casual dissection of a life. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice, held up a dented canteen, a tarnished belt buckle, a pair of worn-out boots. "What am I bid for the belongings of this famous scoundrel?" he bellowed, a smirk playing on his lips. The bids were few and mocking. It was a spectacle, not a sale. Finally, the auctioneer held up a battered leather pack. It was made of thick, oiled hide, darkened with age and hard use. The straps were frayed, and one of the buckles was missing, replaced with a crude knot of rawhide. It had been stitched with a heavy, uneven hand, a purely functional object meant to withstand rough travel. "Look at this sorry thing." The auctioneer laughed, probably full of holes as Kane himself. "Who'll give me a quarter for it?" The crowd chuckled. May looked at the pack, and for the first time she saw something other than her own ruin. She saw the deep scratches in the leather, the story of its journey. She saw the strong, if clumsy, stitching, and recognized the work of a man who knew how to make things last. And beneath the dirt and wear, she saw good leather, thick and unbroken in the main body of the pack. It could be cleaned, patched, the straps replaced. The leather alone was worth more than a quarter. It was something that could be mended. A man in the crowd yelled, "I'll give you 10 cents for the scrap." Another laugh rippled through the onlookers. May felt a sudden, sharp clarity. It was the only thing of value she had seen all day. She pushed her way forward, her voice quiet but firm. "I'll give you 50 cents. She held up her last coin, the silver $half gleaming in the harsh Wyoming sun. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. He looked from the coin to her plain, dusty face. A slow, cruel smile spread across his features. 50 cents. The lady in gray sees a diamond in the rough. Going once, going twice, sold. To the discerning woman with more sense than sense. The crowd's laughter followed her as she stepped forward and traded her last piece of currency for the dead outlaw's pack. She did not acknowledge their jeers. She took the pack, its weight and substance a comfort in her hands, and walked away from the crowd, away from the town, heading toward the low, scrub-covered hills at the edge of Redemption. She did not know where she was going, but she knew she was carrying the only thing in the world that was hers. It was a sorry inheritance, but it was a start. The leather was cool and smooth under her fingers, and she could already feel the familiar, calming rhythm of the work that lay ahead, the cleaning, the conditioning, the patient pulling of a needle and thread. May walked until the sounds of the town faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. She found a sheltered spot in the lee of a rock outcropping, a place where she could be alone. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the plains. She sat on the dry, sandy ground and placed the pack in her lap. For a long moment, she just looked at it, running her hands over the scarred surface. It smelled of dust, horse sweat, and something else, a faint, metallic tang she couldn't place. It was heavier than it should have been for an empty pack. She began her inspection with the practiced eye her grandmother had taught her. She checked the main seams first, running her thumb along the thick, waxed thread. The stitching was crude, but strong. She examined the frayed straps, noting how the leather had been worn thin near the attachment points. The missing buckle was a simple fix. A new one could be fashioned from scrap metal, or even carved from bone if need be. She turned the pack over and over, her fingers probing, learning its history. It was as she was examining the interior that she felt it. Along the back panel, the part that would rest against a rider's back, the lining was different. Most of the inside was rough, unfinished leather, but this one section, a square roughly the size of her hand, was covered with a patch of softer deerskin. It was stitched down with a finer thread than the rest of the pack, the stitches small and neat, almost invisible. But they were not quite perfect. Near one corner, she felt a subtle lump, and the thread there was looser. A tiny loop pulled up from the surface. Her heart gave a small, distinct thump. It was a hiding place. She had mended enough clothes, patched enough blankets, to recognize a secret seam. Someone had taken great care to make this look like a simple repair, a reinforcement against wear. But the different thread, the careful placement, the slight bulge beneath, it was deliberate. She took a deep breath, the dry, sage-scented air calming her. From the small cloth pouch in her pocket, she retrieved not the thimble, but a tiny sewing kit her grandmother had made for her. It contained a few needles, a spool of dark thread, and a small, sharp blade no bigger than her little finger, honed for cutting stitches. With painstaking care, May inserted the tip of the blade under the loose thread and snipped. One by one, she began to cut the stitches, her movements precise and economical. The thread was old and brittle, and it parted with a series of tiny, satisfying snaps. After a few moments, she had opened one side of the deerskin patch. She peeled it back carefully. Inside, nestled within the thick leather of the pack itself, was a hollowed-out space, and in that space lay a small, flat package wrapped in oilskin and tied with a bit of twine. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted it out. It was cool to the touch and surprisingly heavy. She worked the knot loose and unfolded the oilskin. Inside were two objects. The first was a piece of paper, folded into a tight square. It was stiff and brittle with age. The second was a letter, the envelope yellowed and stained along one edge with a dark, reddish-brown smudge that could only be dried blood. May unfolded the piece of paper first. It was a map, drawn in charcoal on a torn sheet of what looked like ledger paper. The lines were rough but clear, depicting a creek, a series of low buttes, and a distinctive rock formation that looked like a broken horn. There were landmarks noted in a scrawled, urgent hand: Shaw's West Fence, Cottonwood Stand, Three Sisters Rocks. An X was marked near the base of the broken horn formation. It was a map to a hidden place, a cache. Her breath caught in her throat. An outlaw's hidden cache could only mean one thing. She set the map aside, her mind reeling, and picked up the letter. The blood stain on the corner was stark against the yellowed paper. Her name was not on it. It was addressed to no one. With unsteady hands, she broke the wax seal, which had crumbled with age, and pulled out the single sheet of paper tucked inside. The handwriting was the same as on the map, but smaller, more deliberate, as if the writer had taken great pains with each word. The letter was dated 2 years prior. It began without salutation. "If you are reading this, I am dead, and you have found my last confession. My name is Silas Kane, and I have been a thief for most of my life. But the money I have hidden is not from a bank or a train. It was taken from a man named Fowler, a freight agent who skimmed from every shipment and starved his own men. I took it believing it was a kind of justice. I was wrong. Fowler and his partners came after me. They did not find me, but they found the Grady farmstead, a family who had given me water and a meal when I was desperate. They thought the Gradys had helped me. They murdered them all. The father, the mother, their 2 small children. A deputy from Redemption, a man named Shaw, was hunting me. He arrived too late to save them. I saw it from the hills. I saw him carry the bodies out. I have carried that sight with me every day since. The money felt like poison after that. I could not spend it. I could not give it back. I have hidden it. It is $5,000 in gold coin. The map shows the way. It is on land near Shaw's own ranch. Perhaps he will know what to do with it. Perhaps it can be returned to the families Fowler cheated. Or perhaps it can do some good for the Grady name. I do not know. All I know is that my justice cost 4 innocent lives, and that is a debt I can never repay. I carry their faces. I hope God has more mercy than I deserve. Do with this what you will. Do better than I did. May read the letter twice, the words sinking into her like stones. $5,000. The sum was astronomical, an impossible fortune. But it was the story that held her, the plain, unvarnished horror of it, the murdered family, the guilt-ridden deputy, the outlaw's failed attempt at penance. This was not a simple treasure map, it was a burden. The money was tangled up in blood and grief. She looked at the bloodstain on the envelope, and it was no longer just a stain, it was a testament. She thought of the auctioneer's mocking voice, the crowd's laughter. They had dismissed this pack, this man's life, as a joke. But inside it was a story of profound and terrible weight. She looked at the map again, at the name Shaw's West Fence. The letter said the deputy who had found the Grady family was named Shaw. It was likely the same man. A man who, according to Silas Kane, still carried the sight of what had happened. He would be the key. May sat for a long time as the sky turned from orange to a deep, star-strewn indigo. The 50 cents she had spent felt like the most significant transaction of her life. She had traded her last coin for a dead man's guilt. But in that guilt was a map, and on that map was a chance. It was a dangerous chance. Fowler's partners, if they were still around, would surely still be looking for this money. But what choice did she have? To stay in Redemption was to starve. To go back east was to return to a life of silent servitude. The map pointed west. It pointed toward a guarded man and a hidden treasure, toward danger and an unknown future. With a resolve that settled deep in her bones, May folded the letter and the map, tucked them back into the oilskin packet, and slipped the packet inside her dress, resting it against her skin. She rose, shouldered the outlaw's pack, and began to walk, not away from town, but parallel to it, following the North Platte River as it flowed west. The weight of the pack on her shoulders felt different now. It was no longer just leather and straps, it was a trust. The journey was not a matter of days, but of weeks. May walked. She had no horse, no wagon, only the worn soles of her shoes and the grim determination that had taken root in her soul. The $5,000 was an abstraction, a number too large to feel real. What felt real was the ache in her feet, the gnawing hunger in her belly, and the constant, watchful tension in her shoulders. She followed the river, using it as her guide, sleeping in dry creek beds or thickets of willow that offered some concealment from the open plains. She learned the landscape with her body. She learned the sting of the wind that never seemed to stop, the burn of the sun on her neck, and the deep, abiding chill of the nights. She ate what she could find, wild onions pulled from the damp soil by the riverbank, the tart, fleshy leaves of purslane, and once, a foolish rabbit she managed to kill with a well-aimed rock. She cooked it over a tiny, smokeless fire of dry sage roots. The skills her grandmother had taught her no longer a comfort, but a necessity for survival. The silver thimble in her pocket was a constant reminder of Elspeth's practical love, a small, hard piece of a past where she had been safe. Now, safety was a luxury she could not afford. She saw other travelers on the main trail that ran parallel to the river, but she avoided them, her lone female figure an invitation to the kind of trouble she could not handle. She became adept at fading into the landscape, her gray dress the color of dust and rock, her movements quiet and deliberate. She was a ghost haunting the edge of the world. After nearly 3 weeks of walking, the land began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and then to the rugged pine-studded foothills of a mountain range she did not know the name of. The air grew thinner, cooler. According to the crude drawing, she was getting close. She began to scan the horizon for the landmarks from Silas Kane's map. The cottonwood stand, the 3 buttes that looked like sisters standing in a row. One afternoon, she saw it. From the top of a rise, she looked down into a wide, shallow valley. A creek, just as the map had shown, snaked through its center, a line of brilliant green in the otherwise sere landscape. And on the far side of the valley, nestled against the base of the foothills, was a small ranch. It was a lonely, isolated place. A simple log house with a stone chimney, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of fences enclosing a few dozen cattle. She could see the west fence line, just as the map described, running up the slope toward a distinctive rock formation. It was the Broken Horn. It was Shaw's ranch. She had found it. May retreated from the ridgeline, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. She spent the rest of the day watching the ranch from a distance, hidden in a stand of aspens. She saw a man emerge from the house. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a kind of weary purpose. He carried 2 buckets to the creek, his back straight, his pace steady. Even from half a mile away, she could sense a stillness about him, a profound solitude. This was Jacob Shaw, the man who had carried the bodies of the Grady family from their home. The man whose grief was written into the very landscape of Silas Kane's map. She knew she could not simply walk up to his door and announce her purpose. A lone woman appearing out of nowhere with a dead outlaw's map would be met with suspicion, if not outright violence. She needed a reason to be there, a plausible story. Her eyes fell to her own worn shoes, the leather cracked and the sole on her right foot beginning to separate. She looked at the outlaw's pack. The answer was there, in the skills Elspeth had given her. She would not be a treasure hunter. She would be a mender. An itinerant worker looking for a day's labor. It was a role she knew how to play. The next morning, she made her way down into the valley, not directly toward the house, but along the creek, as if she were just passing through. She walked with a deliberate weariness, allowing the genuine fatigue of her journey to show in her posture. When she was within sight of the house, she sat by the water and took off her shoes, making a show of examining the damaged sole. She waited. It did not take long. A dog began to bark from the ranch, a deep, resonant sound. A few minutes later, the man himself appeared, walking down from the house. He carried a rifle in the crook of his arm, its presence casual but unambiguous. He stopped about 30 feet away from her. "You're on private land," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was not an unkind voice, but it held no welcome. May looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. She did not stand immediately. "I know, I'm sorry for the trespass," she said, her own voice quiet. "My shoe gave out. I was just hoping to fix it before I moved on." She held up the shoe so he could see the flapping sole. Jacob Shaw looked at her for a long moment. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and something deeper. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they were filled with a watchfulness that went beyond simple caution. They were the eyes of a man who expects the worst. He was perhaps 40, with streaks of gray in his dark hair and a deep line etched between his brows. He looked at her dusty dress, her thin face, and the outlaw's pack lying on the ground beside her. His gaze lingered on the pack for a second too long. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Nowhere in particular," she answered honestly. "Looking for work. I'm good with a needle. Mending, Leatherwork, anything. It was a risk, mentioning leatherwork while carrying that specific pack, but it was also her most valuable skill. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He knew the pack. He had likely seen it on Silas Kane's horse, or perhaps at the auction. "There's no work here," he said, his tone final. He started to turn away. "I have the letter," May said, the words leaving her before she had fully decided to speak them. He stopped. He did not turn around, but his whole body went rigid. "What letter?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Silas Kane's letter," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The one he left with the map." Slowly, Jacob Shaw turned back to face her. The weariness in his expression had been replaced by a sharp, painful intensity. The grief she had only guessed at was now starkly visible, a raw wound laid bare. "Show me," he commanded. May reached inside the bodice of her dress and pulled out the oilskin packet. Her hands were steady. She was no longer just a desperate traveler. She was the keeper of a secret, and it gave her a strange kind of authority. She unfolded the brittle paper of the letter and held it out to him. He did not move to take it. He read it from where he stood, his gray eyes scanning the page, his jaw tight. He read it through once, and then again. The silence stretched, broken only by the gurgle of the creek and the distant lowing of a cow. When he finally looked up, the hardness in his eyes had fractured, revealing the deep well of sorrow beneath. "He saw," Jacob said, his voice raspy with emotion. "He was in the hills. He saw me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of dawning, horrified understanding. For 2 years, Jacob had carried the weight of the Grady massacre alone, blaming himself for his failure to arrive in time. Now, he learned that he had been watched by the very man whose actions had led to the tragedy. The knowledge seemed to land on him like a physical blow. May saw the shift in him, the wall of his solitude cracking open. This was her chance. "The money is still out there," she said softly. He wanted it to do some good. Jacob looked from the letter to her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw not just a drifter, but a woman who had somehow come into possession of the final, tangled piece of his own past. "Why did you come here?" he asked, the question genuine now. "Why not just take the map and find it yourself?" "Because I can't do it alone," May said simply. "And because the letter isn't just about money. It's about them. The Gradys." She had said the right thing. The name, spoken aloud, hung in the air between them. Jacob's shoulders slumped slightly, a barely perceptible admission of a shared burden. He finally gave a slow, weary nod. "Come up to the house," he said. "We'll talk." As May gathered her things and followed him toward the silent log cabin, she felt the first tentative shift in her own fate. The Outlaw's pack had brought her to this place of grief, but it had also brought her to the one person who could understand its terrible weight. The rebuilding had begun, not with wood or stone, but with the cautious, fragile laying of a foundation of trust between two strangers bound by a dead man's confession. The inside of Jacob's house was as spare and guarded as the man himself. It was one large room, meticulously clean but starkly empty of comfort. A narrow bed was neatly made in one corner. A simple table and 2 chairs stood near the stone hearth, and a few cast-iron pots hung from hooks on the wall. There were no pictures, no curtains on the single window, no sign of the life that might have existed here before. It was the home of a man who was waiting for nothing. Jacob gestured for her to sit at the table while he put a pot of coffee on the stove. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. May placed the map on the table between them. Jacob sat down opposite her, his large hands resting on the worn wood. He stared at the charcoal lines, his expression unreadable. "I hunted Kane for 6 months," he said, his voice low. "Tracked him from Kansas territory. Always a day behind. When I heard he was circling back toward redemption, I thought I had him." He paused, his gaze distant. "The Gradys, they were good people. John and Sarah. They had a boy, Thomas, and a little girl, Lucy. I'd shared a meal with them not a month before. When I got the word that Fowler's men were in the area, I rode as fast as I could. He stopped, his throat working. I was too late. Kane was right. I carried them out myself. May listened, her own hardships seeming small and insignificant in the face of his profound loss. This wasn't just about a deputy's failure. It was personal. The money Kane stole, Jacob continued, his voice regaining its hard edge, it was from the Black Hills Freight Company. Fowler was the agent, a thief in a suit. He was skimming gold dust from every payroll shipment he handled. Kane's robbery exposed him. Fowler was arrested, but his partners, a man named Jedediah Stone and another called Lefty Grimes, they were never caught. They believe that money is theirs. He looked directly at May, his eyes sharp. If you found that pack, it means they're still looking. Coming here makes you a target. It makes me a target. Before May could respond, his dog, a grizzled hound with one floppy ear, began barking again, a low, insistent warning. Jacob was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. He peered out, his body tense. 2 riders were approaching on the valley trail. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door. "Stay here. And stay quiet." May's blood ran cold. She moved away from the table, pressing herself into the shadows of the corner. Her hand instinctively going to the small, hard shape of the thimble in her pocket. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. The 2 riders reined in their horses a respectful distance from the house. One was a large, bull-necked man with a florid face and a fine coat, despite the dust and heat. The other was wiry, with a pinched face and a left hand that was missing 2 fingers. Jedediah Stone and Lefty Grimes. "Shaw," Stone said, his voice overly friendly. "Good to see you. We were just in the area looking for some stray cattle. Thought we'd stop and see if you'd seen any." "Haven't seen any strays," Jacob said, his voice flat. His gaze was fixed on Stone, but May knew he was aware of every twitch from the man called Lefty. "Funny thing," Stone went on, ignoring the cold reception. "We heard Silas Kane's gear was sold off in redemption. We were wondering if anyone happened to buy his old pack. Heard it went for a song." The question was aimed at Jacob, but May felt it like a physical touch. They knew, or they suspected. They were sniffing the trail. "I wouldn't know," Jacob said. "I don't much care for auctions." "Of course not," Stone said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Well, if you see anyone new in the valley, a woman, maybe, you let us know. There's a reward." He didn't say what the reward was for. He didn't have to. The threat was clear. After another moment of tense silence, Stone tipped his hat. "Good day to you, Shaw." They turned their horses and rode away, their departure as unhurried as their arrival. Jacob watched them until they were out of sight, his posture rigid. He came back inside, his face grim. "They know," May whispered. "They suspect." He corrected her. "They don't know about the map. Not yet. But they will. They'll be watching this valley now." He looked at May, his expression a mixture of frustration and a new, grudging respect. "You've brought a whole new kind of trouble to my door, Miss Whitcomb," she supplied. "May Whitcomb." "Well, Miss Whitcomb," he said, a flicker of something almost like a smile touching his lips. "It seems we're in this together. Let's find that money before they do." The shared danger had sealed their alliance more effectively than any promise. The work of rebuilding now had a new urgency. It was no longer just about honoring the dead, it was about surviving the living. They spent the next day planning, their heads bent over the map at the small table. Jacob, with his intimate knowledge of the land, was able to decipher Kane's rough landmarks. The Three Sisters Rocks were a known formation a mile up the canyon behind his house. The Cottonwood Stand was a small, spring-fed grove on the north slope. The X was located in a difficult, rocky area at the base of the Broken Horn Butte, a place that was hard to see from the valley floor. He chose the spot well, Jacob observed, his finger tracing the charcoal lines. It's sheltered from the trail, and the ground is all rock and shale. Hard to dig, but also hard to spot a disturbance. They decided to move at night. Stone and Grimes would be watching the ranch during the day, but the darkness would give them cover. That evening, as dusk settled, they gathered their tools, 2 shovels, a pickaxe, and a lantern. Jacob also carried his rifle, and he handed May an old but well-oiled Colt revolver. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. May shook her head. He spent 10 minutes showing her, his instructions patient and precise. How to load it, how to cock the hammer, how to aim. The weight of the gun in her hand was cold and unfamiliar. A stark contrast to the familiar comfort of a needle or an awl. But she listened carefully, absorbing the lesson with the same focus she gave to everything else. Under the thin light of a crescent moon, they set out. They moved through the darkness like shadows, Jacob leading the way with an unerring sense of direction. The air was cold, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground and the cry of a distant coyote. When they reached the base of the broken horn, they found the spot exactly where the map indicated, a small, level patch of ground sheltered by a granite overhang. They lit the lantern, keeping the light low. The ground was just as Jacob had predicted, a hard-packed mix of dirt and shattered rock. The work was slow and grueling. They took turns with the pickaxe, breaking up the stubborn earth and then shoveling the debris aside. For hours they dug, their breath pluming in the cold air, the rhythmic scrape and thud of their tools the only sound. May's hands, accustomed to fine work, were soon raw and blistered, but she didn't complain. She matched Jacob's pace, her small frame wiry and strong from her long journey. They were nearly 4 feet down when Jacob's shovel struck something that wasn't rock. It was a dull, metallic thud. Their eyes met in the lantern light. Working carefully now, they cleared the dirt away, revealing the top of a small, iron-strapped chest. It was rusted and caked with mud, but it was intact. As Jacob worked the pickaxe under one edge to pry it loose, a sound broke the stillness, the unmistakable clatter of a dislodged stone from the slope above them. They both froze. Jacob instantly extinguished the lantern, plunging them into near-total darkness. He grabbed his rifle. "Get behind the rock," he whispered, pushing May toward the granite overhang. 2 figures appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the starry sky, Stone and Grimes. "I told you they'd come here," Stone's voice boomed, echoing in the quiet canyon. "Clever girl, leading us right to it." A shot rang out, and a chip of granite exploded from the rock just above May's head. "Stay down!" Jacob yelled, returning fire. The canyon erupted in a chaos of shouting and gunfire. May pressed herself against the cold stone, the unused revolver heavy in her hand. She could hear Jacob moving, firing from different positions to make it seem like there were more than one of them. But they were trapped, pinned down in the hole they had just dug. Another shot ricocheted dangerously close. Suddenly, a new sound joined the fray, the thunder of hooves coming fast up the canyon trail. And then another voice, a deep bellow from the darkness below. "Shaw! You all right up there?" It was a man from a neighboring ranch, a gruff old-timer named Peterson who rarely spoke to anyone. Another shot came, not from above but from the side. One of the figures on the ridge cried out and fell. From another direction, a lantern flared to life, and another man, the town blacksmith, stepped into view, a shotgun leveled at the ridge. "You boys picked the wrong valley to cause trouble in," the blacksmith called out. Stone, seeing he was now outnumbered and outflanked, fired one last angry shot into the darkness and then scrambled away, dragging the wounded Grimes with him. The sound of their horses retreating faded into the night. A quiet fell over the canyon. Slowly Jacob stood up. Peterson and the blacksmith, whose name was Cole, climbed up to their position. "We saw their horses tied at the mouth of the canyon," Cole explained, his face grim in the renewed lantern light. "Figured they were up to no good. Peterson just grunted, reloading his rifle. Heard the shooting. Knew it'd be you, Shaw. It was a simple statement of fact, but underneath it was a current of steadfast loyalty. These solitary men, neighbors who rarely interacted beyond a nod on the trail, had come without being asked. They had seen trouble at Jacob's ranch, and they had come. Community, May realized, was not about friendly chatter over a fence. It was about showing up in the dark with a rifle when it mattered. Jacob looked at the two men, his neighbors, and for the first time since May had met him, the deep, weary caution in his eyes eased. "Thank you," he said, the two words carrying the weight of years of solitude. In the aftermath, a new kind of quiet settled over the valley. Jedediah Stone and Lefty Grimes were captured by the marshal a day later, their greed having finally run its course. The iron chest was hauled back to Jacob's ranch. Inside, just as Silas Kane's letter had promised, was $5,000 in gold coin, a fortune that glittered in the morning light. For a week, the chest sat on Jacob's table, a silent testament to the blood and regret it represented. They spoke at length about what to do with it. A portion was sent back to the Black Hills, anonymously, to be distributed to the families of the men Fowler had cheated. Another $1,000 was given to the town of Redemption to build a proper schoolhouse, with a small, simple plaque dedicated to the memory of the Grady family. The rest, Jacob insisted, belonged to May. Kane's letter was a trust, he said, his voice firm. You fulfilled it. This is yours. It was more money than she could comprehend, a sum that promised not luxury, but security. Freedom with it, May did not leave. The valley had begun to feel like a home. She bought a small, abandoned homestead a few miles down the creek from Jacob, a place with a crumbling sod-roofed cabin and 20 acres of overgrown pasture. It was a ruin, much like the Outlaw's pack had been, but May saw the good bones beneath the decay. She saw a place that could be mended. The community, which had revealed itself in a flash of gunfire, now coalesced around her in quiet, practical acts of generosity. Cole, the blacksmith, forged new hinges for her cabin door and a set of hooks for her hearth. Peterson, the gruff rancher, appeared one afternoon with a milk cow and its calf, leaving them in her pasture without a word. Jacob was a constant, steady presence. He helped her replaster the chinking between the logs of her cabin, taught her how to repair the collapsed section of the roof, and showed her how to clear the sagebrush from the pasture to make way for good grass. They worked side by side, the shared labor a language more intimate than words. Her name became known. She was no longer the strange woman who had appeared from nowhere. She was May Whitcomb, the woman who was bringing the old Miller place back to life. Small rituals formed. She would bring a loaf of fresh-baked bread to Jacob's door once a week, and he would leave a dressed rabbit or a brace of quail on her porch in return. The unwanted pack, bought with her last coin, had transformed from a burden into a living place, a livelihood, a refuge filled with purpose. One cool autumn evening, May sat on the newly repaired porch of her own home, a cup of warm tea in her hands. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, the same sky she had watched on her first night outside of Redemption, when all she owned was the pack. The cabin behind her was warm and bright, a fire crackling in the hearth. The air smelled of pine smoke and damp earth. She was mending one of Jacob's work shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. Her fingers, no longer raw from digging but calloused from labor, moved with a familiar, confident rhythm. On the small table beside her sat two objects. One was her grandmother's silver thimble, its surface gleaming softly in the fading light. It was a link to her past, to the woman who had taught her that anything broken could be mended. Next to it, she had placed the tarnished belt buckle from Silas Kane's pack, an object she had kept from his effects. It was a reminder of the outlaw's confession, of the journey that had brought her here. Two objects from two different lives, a woman she had loved and a man she had never met, both of whom had, in their own way, provided for her future. She looked out across her land, toward the dark line of the foothills, where the broken horn stood silhouetted against the sky. She thought of the auctioneer's sneering face, the 50 cents that had felt like the end of the world. She thought of Jacob, a man slowly emerging from the prison of his own grief, his quiet smiles becoming more frequent, the haunted look in his eyes beginning to fade. A horse and rider appeared on the trail from his ranch, moving at a steady, familiar pace. It was Jacob, coming for his weekly supper. He raised a hand in greeting, and she raised hers in return. May Whitcomb was 23, and she was home. She had traded her last coin for a dead man's pack, and it was the best 50 cents she had ever spent. What began as a story of loss, of being cast out and abandoned, had become a story of finding. She had not just found a fortune, she had found a community, she had found a purpose, and she had found a quiet, sturdy place in the world to call her own. What would you do if the only home you'd ever known was stolen from you with a piece of paper? For Fanny Marsh, a quiet woman of 29 in the vast, unforgiving expanse of 1870s Colorado, this wasn't a question. It was the cold iron truth. She was driven from her late father's valley homestead by a cattle company that claimed her deed, the paper he'd treasured his entire life, was a forgery. But the truth waiting for her in the shadow of a shunned and forgotten silver mine would not only challenge the most powerful men in the territory, but rewrite the history of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of how being cast out can sometimes be the only way to find your way home. The dust of the road clung to the hem of Fanny's worn wool skirt, a second skin of grit and defeat. She stood before the Providence Gulch Mercantile, the false-fronted buildings of the town looming like judgmental elders. In her hand, she held the notice from the Sterling Cattle Company. The ink was stark and merciless against the cheap paper, declaring her father's deed to their quarter section null and void. A clerk's error from decades past, they called it. A clerical oversight that just so happened to favor the largest and most powerful ranching outfit west of the Divide. Fanny had ridden into town that morning with a quiet hope, a belief in the simple fairness of things. She'd stood before the county clerk, a man with a perpetually sweating brow, and presented her father's papers. He hadn't been able to meet her eyes. He'd merely pushed the Sterling Company's notice across the counter, his finger tracing the signature of its regional director, Elias Thorne. "I'm sorry, Miss Marsh," he'd muttered. "Their claim is formidable." Now, leaning against the rough sawn planks of the mercantile wall, the weight of her loss settled not in her mind, but deep in her bones. She remembered her father, a man carved from the same stubborn rock as the mountains that cradled their home, pressing the deed into her hand just before he'd passed the winter before. "This is more than paper, Fan," he'd rasped, his voice thin as autumn smoke. "This is sweat. This is roots. Don't let anyone ever tell you it ain't yours." The memory was a fresh pain, a hot coal in the pit of her stomach. She had failed him. The town bustled around her, a river of noise and indifference. Men in dusty hats tipped their brims to passing ladies, their glances sliding right past Fanny as if she were a ghost already. She was a woman alone, without land, without family, without a single dollar to her name beyond the few coins in her pocket, meant for salt and flour. Her world had been reduced to what she could carry: the clothes on her back, a small satchel of her mother's things, and the aging, sad-eyed mule, Jedediah, currently tied to the hitching post, his ears drooping in sympathetic misery. Elias Thorne himself had ridden past not an hour ago, his horse a fine, glossy black that seemed to sneer at Jedediah's dusty coat. Thorne had met her gaze, a flicker of triumphant cruelty in his eyes, before turning away. He hadn't needed to say a word. The message was clear: you are nothing. You are gone. The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The air grew colder. People were heading home, to warm stoves and evening meals. Home, the word was a phantom limb, an ache for something that was no longer there. She couldn't go back to the homestead. Thorne's men were likely already there, running her few chickens and turning their cattle onto her father's carefully tended pasture. She had nowhere to go. A gust of wind whipped down the street, carrying the scent of pine and the deeper, colder smell of the high country. It also carried a memory, another one of her father's stories, told on a winter night by the fire. He'd spoken of the old Silence Mine, a failed silver strike up the canyon, sealed and abandoned 30 years ago. He'd mentioned a small, unclaimed parcel of government land beside it, a piece nobody wanted because it was too rocky, too steep, and too close to a place the townspeople refused to speak of. A place of bad luck and buried secrets. At the time, it was just a story. Now, it was a destination. It was the only direction left to go. Fanny untied Jedediah's reins, her movements slow and deliberate, each one an act of defiance against the despair that threatened to swallow her whole. The mule nudged her shoulder with his soft nose, a silent question. She stroked his neck, her calloused fingers finding comfort in the familiar coarse hair. "It's just us, old boy," she murmured, her voice raspy. "We'll find a place." She swung herself up onto his bare back, her satchel clutched in one hand, the useless deed still crumpled in the other. She didn't look back at the town of Providence Gulch as she urged Jedediah toward the mouth of the canyon. She looked forward, toward the looming shadows of the mountains, toward the one place in the entire valley that was as forgotten and dismissed as she was. The path was steep and winding, leading away from the fertile valley floor and into the rocky throat of the high country. The air grew thin and sharp, with the scent of pine and cold stone. Every step Jedediah took felt like a step away from her past, from the life that had been ripped from her. The valley below, with its patchwork of ranches and the distant ribbon of the river, was a paradise she was being exiled from. Up here, the land was harsh, unforgiving, gnarled junipers clung to the stony slopes, and the wind had a lonely, keening sound. She rode until the last light bled from the sky, leaving only a wash of stars against an indigo canvas. Finally, she saw it. Set back from the trail, in a small, sheltered bowl of land, was the sealed entrance to the Silence Mine. It was a scar on the mountainside, a heap of rockfall and massive, weathered timbers jammed against the dark maw of the earth. A crude sign, faded and split, was nailed to a nearby pine. The words were barely legible. "Danger, keep out." It looked less like a warning and more like a gravestone. This was the dismissed object, the place of whispers and bad luck. The ground around it was rocky and uneven, dotted with hardy brush. But there was a small, relatively flat clearing a stone's throw from the entrance, sheltered by a granite outcrop. It wasn't a home. It wasn't even a decent campsite. But it was unclaimed. It was a place where no one would bother her, because no one ever came here. She slid off Jedediah's back, her legs stiff and cold. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. Even the crickets were quiet here. It was the kind of silence that felt ancient and watchful. This was what she was reduced to: a woman, a mule, and a ghost of a mine on a piece of land nobody wanted. She had traded her father's legacy, a place of life and memory, for a patch of dirt next to a tomb. What secrets was this mountain holding? Was the mine truly just a place of bad luck? Or was there something more buried with the silver? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for the rest of Fanny's incredible story. As she stood there in the chilling darkness, little did she know that the ground beneath her feet held the answer not just to her own future, but to the stolen past of the entire valley. The next morning, Fanny rode Jedediah back into Providence Gulch for the few supplies she could afford. The town felt different now. Yesterday, she had been a resident, a landowner facing a dispute. Today, she was an outcast. As she walked toward the mercantile, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Whispers followed her like shadows. "That's her," a woman muttered to her companion, clutching her basket tighter. the marsh girl, lost the valley place. Another group of men standing outside the saloon fell silent as she passed, their speculative gazes making her skin crawl. They weren't just looking at a woman who'd lost her home. They were looking at a loose thread, a problem that had, for now, conveniently removed itself. Inside the mercantile, the clerk who had been friendly just a week ago was suddenly brisk and efficient, avoiding her gaze as he measured out a small bag of flour and a handful of beans. The transaction was cold, clinical. She was no longer a neighbor. She was Charity, or worse, a ghost haunting the edges of their prosperous lives. As she stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, a voice, loud and dripping with contempt, cut through the street noise. Well, look what the mountain coughed up. It was Elias Thorne, leaning against a post, a smug grin spreading across his face. I heard you found new lodgings, Miss Marsh. Getting friendly with the ghosts up at the Silence? His laughter was a sharp, ugly sound. A few of his cronies, loitering nearby, joined in. Fanny felt a hot flush of shame and anger rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze, her expression a mask of stony indifference. She would not give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply turned, loaded her meager supplies onto Jedediah's back, and prepared to leave. Her silence seemed to infuriate him more than any retort could have. You run along, he called after her, his voice hard. That's where people like you belong. In the shadows, with the other forgotten things. She didn't look back. She just kept walking, her back straight, each step a silent refusal to break. As she reached the edge of town, a figure stepped out from the narrow alley between the blacksmith and the livery. It was an old Ute woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, her black eyes holding a depth that seemed to span generations. The townspeople called her Salt Woman because she appeared only a few times a year to trade hides for salt, speaking to almost no one. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that made the bustling town seem flimsy and temporary. The old woman raised a hand, and Fanny instinctively stopped. She reached out a dry, warm hand and placed it gently on Fanny's forearm. Her touch was surprisingly firm, grounding. She looked from Fanny's face to the distant canyon where the mine lay hidden. The mountain remembers, the woman said, her voice low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. What the valley forgets. That was all. She gave Fanny's arm a final, reassuring squeeze, then turned and disappeared back into the alley as silently as she had appeared. Fanny stood frozen for a moment, the woman's words echoing in the sudden quiet. The mountain remembers what the valley forgets. It was a riddle, a proverb, a warning. She didn't know what. But it felt like the first true thing anyone had said to her all day. It settled in her heart not as a threat, but as a sliver of strange, unasked for hope. What had the valley chosen to forget? And what did the mountain where she now slept have to do with it? The question followed her all the way back up the winding trail, a single, persistent note in the symphony of her loss. The journey back to her makeshift camp felt different this time. The cryptic words of the old Ute woman had shifted something in the landscape. The mountain no longer felt like a place of exile, but one of secrets. When she arrived, the late afternoon sun was slanting through the pines, casting long shadows across the sealed mine entrance. The place was still and silent, but it was a silence that now felt less empty and more expectant. Fanny slid from Jedediah's back and let him graze on the sparse patches of grass. She took a moment to truly study her new surroundings. The mine was sealed with a jumble of massive timbers and what looked like half the mountainside. It was a chaotic mess, designed to look like a natural rock slide, but the sheer volume of it seemed excessive. Why go to such trouble to close a simple failed mine? She unpacked her supplies, her movements methodical and calming. She built a small, careful fire in a ring of stones she'd assembled the night before, the smoke rising thin and straight in the still air. As dusk began to settle, she sat on a flat rock, sipping hot, weak tea from a tin cup, her gaze fixed on the dark heap of the mine. This was her first real night living beside it, her first conscious act of making this place a temporary home. The sounds of the high country began to emerge as the light faded. The hoot of a distant owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth, the sigh of the wind through the high branches of the ponderosas. But from the mine itself, there was nothing. A profound, unnatural stillness. As she listened, she watched Jedediah. The mule, who was usually skittish in new places, seemed remarkably at ease. Instead of staying close to the fire, he wandered over to the edge of the rockfall, sealing the mine. He stood there for a long time, his head lowered, his long ears pointed forward, perfectly still. He wasn't sniffing the air or pawing the ground. He was just listening. It was an odd behavior. Her father had always said you could trust a mule's instincts over a man's word. Animals felt things humans missed, a change in the weather, the scent of a predator, the tremor of the earth. Jedediah's calm vigilance was unsettling. He wasn't afraid, he was attentive. It was as if he were listening to a conversation she couldn't hear. Fanny wrapped her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The fire crackled, spitting embers into the growing darkness. She laid out her bedroll near the granite outcrop, using her satchel as a pillow. The rock at her back still held a faint warmth from the day's sun. Lying there, staring up at the brilliant spray of stars, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. She was utterly alone, a tiny speck of life clinging to the edge of a great, silent mystery. The mountain loomed over her, a vast, dark shape against the sky. It felt ancient, powerful, and indifferent. Yet, the old woman's words returned to her. The mountain remembers. Lying there in the cold, Fanny closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it remembered. She thought of the miners who had worked here. Their hopes for a silver fortune. She thought of the collapse, the story everyone in the valley avoided. Had men died in there? Was that the source of the bad luck, or was it something else entirely? A strange peace began to settle over her. For the first time since receiving Thorne's notice, the frantic panic in her chest subsided. The path forward was gone, her past was barricaded. All she had was this moment, this place, and for reasons she couldn't name, her mule's quiet stillness beside the dark mine felt less like an omen of danger and more like an invitation to listen. What was Jedediah hearing in the deep silence of the mountain? A week passed. Fanny fell into a spare, hard rhythm of survival. Mornings were spent gathering firewood and checking the simple snares she'd set for rabbits. Afternoons were for mending her worn clothes or simply sitting, watching the light change on the face of the mountain. She was becoming a part of the landscape, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as the lichen on the rocks. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant companion. But it was slowly changing from a sharp pain into a dull, familiar ache. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled down from the peaks. Rain came in blinding sheets, turning her small campsite into a muddy soup. Torrents of water cascaded down the mountainside, washing loose dirt and rock toward her lean-to. Fearing a mudslide, Fanny grabbed her father's old shovel, the one tool she'd had the foresight to tie to Jedediah's pack, and began frantically digging a diversion trench. The work was brutal. The rain plastered her hair to her face and soaked her through to the bone, but a desperate energy fueled her. As she dug, her shovel striking rock and mud, she worked her way closer to the base of the mine's sealed entrance. The runoff was thickest there, sluicing away years of accumulated soil and scree. After the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and dripping, Fanny stood panting, leaning on her shovel. Her trench had held. Her small camp was safe. It was then that she noticed it. The deluge had exposed something at the very bottom of the rockfall, the dark, glistening end of a wooden beam. It was different from the other timbers used to seal the mine. Those were rough-hewn pine logs, weathered to a silver gray. This piece was darker, denser, almost black with age and water. It looked like petrified oak, and it was set deeper, as if it were part of an older, buried structure. Curiosity overriding her exhaustion, she knelt in the mud and began to clear the remaining debris from around it. Her fingers, raw and cold, scraped away dirt and pebbles. As more of the wood was revealed, she saw the carving. It wasn't a name or a date. It was a precise, deliberate symbol, a perfect square with a single, straight line drawn vertically through its center. She'd seen marks like it before, on the old boundary stones of her father's property. It was a surveyor's mark. But it was a variation she didn't recognize, and it was in a place that made no sense. Why would a surveyor's mark be on a timber used to seal a mine, buried under tons of rock? It didn't fit the narrative of a simple accidental collapse. It felt intentional. It felt like a clue. She tried to pry the beam loose, but it was wedged tight, a silent testament to some long-forgotten purpose. She sat back on her heels, the dripping forest silent around her, and stared at the strange symbol. It was a piece of a puzzle she didn't know she was solving. A single, anomalous detail in a story everyone else had accepted as truth. For days she had been living beside the mine, seeing it only as a monument to failure and bad luck. Now, for the first time, she saw it as something else. It wasn't just a sealed hole in the ground. It was a message. She just didn't know how to read it yet. Leaving the timber where it lay, she returned to her fire, her mind racing. The symbol was a loose thread, and Fanny Marsh, with nothing left to lose, felt a sudden, fierce determination to pull on it. A few days later, a man on horseback rode up the trail. Fanny, wary, watched him approach from the cover of the trees. He wasn't one of Thorne's rough-looking ranch hands. This man was lean and wore practical, clean clothes. He sat his horse with an easy confidence, but his eyes, as they scanned the landscape, were sharp and methodical. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from her camp. "Miss Marsh?" he called out, his voice calm and even. Fanny stepped into the clearing, her hand resting on the handle of the small axe she used for firewood. "I'm Fanny Marsh." The man dismounted, holding his hat in his hand. "My name is Nathan Vale. The Sterling Company hired me to survey the disputed boundary lines." Fanny's heart sank. He was one of them. She braced herself for another dismissal, another smug assertion of Thorne's power. But Nathan's expression held no malice. It was serious, professional, and perhaps a little weary. "I'm not here to trouble you," he said, seeming to read her thoughts. "My job is to measure the land, to record what is there. Nothing more." He had a quiet, direct way of speaking that she found herself trusting against her better judgment. Over the next few days, Nathan became a regular presence on the mountainside. He worked with a quiet intensity, setting up his transit, driving stakes, and making meticulous notes in a small leather book. He never intruded on her camp, but he would often greet her with a polite nod in the morning or a quiet good evening as dusk fell. One afternoon, he saw her staring at the exposed timber at the base of the mine. He walked over, his boots making little sound on the damp earth. "That's an interesting piece of oak," he said, his surveyor's eye immediately drawn to the carving. He knelt for a closer look. "Where did you find this?" "The storm washed it out," Fanny replied, watching him carefully. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He murmured, tracing the symbol with his finger. "That's a witness corner mark. An old one. Hasn't been used in 30 years. He looked from the beam to the chaotic heap of the mine seal, then back again. A witness corner is a reference point for a survey plat. It's used to mark a boundary line when you can't place a stone right on the corner itself. It points to the real marker. A slow dawning comprehension began to light in his eyes. This shouldn't be here. Not like this. His professional curiosity was piqued. The anomaly that had bothered Fanny now had a name and a function, and it was deeply out of place. While Nathan continued his official survey, a new kind of work began for Fanny. Driven by a purpose she hadn't felt in months, she started clearing the brush and loose rock from around the mine entrance. It wasn't a conscious decision to try and open it. It was a need to impose order on the chaos, to understand the shape of the thing she was living beside. Her hands, already calloused, grew tougher. She learned the weight and balance of the rocks, the grain of the broken timbers. Jedediah often stood nearby, his quiet presence a comfort. Her labor was a form of investigation. With every rock she moved, every piece of rotten wood she cleared away, she was learning the grammar of the collapse, and the more she cleared, the more it looked wrong. Some of the other timbers, as she uncovered them, also bore markings, faded, painted numbers, a 3 on one, a V on another. They seemed random, meaningless. She pointed them out to Nathan one evening as he was packing up his equipment. He came over, his brow furrowed in thought. He sketched the numbers and the witness mark in his notebook. This wasn't a cave-in, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This was a construction, or a deconstruction. These numbers, they looked like a sequence. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a question that was as massive and immovable as the mountain itself. Why would someone go to the trouble of systematically burying a mine and marking it with a secret survey point? The numbers on the timbers became their guide. Nathan, with his knowledge of old engineering and survey methods, began to see a pattern. The numbers weren't random. They indicated a sequence for demolition, a precise and deliberate collapse designed to be permanent. They sealed it from the inside out, he explained, pointing to how the main support beams had been cut and blasted. And this rockfall, it was directed. All of it. The witness mark on the oak beam was the key. According to the old surveying manuals Nathan kept in his saddlebags, that particular mark pointed toward a true survey monument, usually within 100 feet. But there was no monument stone anywhere in the clearing. Unless, Nathan said, his eyes scanning the jumble of the rockfall itself, the monument isn't on the mountain. What if it's in it? Their focus shifted. They weren't just clearing debris anymore. They were searching for a hidden doorway. Following the logic of the witness corner and the numbered beams, they began to concentrate their efforts on a section of the rockfall to the left of the main entrance. It looked as solid as the rest, but some of the larger boulders seemed oddly placed, wedged together in a way that defied natural physics. It was back-breaking work. For 2 days, they labored together, using pry bars Nathan fetched from his camp and the sheer stubborn strength of their bodies. Fanny worked with a focused intensity, her grief and anger channeled into the physical act of moving stone. Nathan, caught up in the mystery, worked alongside her, his quiet respect for her growing with every hour. Finally, their pry bar slid into a deep crevice and met with a hollow sound. With a final, coordinated heave, they dislodged a massive flat stone. It fell away with a deep groan, revealing not a mineshaft, but a small, dark alcove, deliberately hidden within the structure of the collapse. It was a man-made cavity, dry and protected, and inside, sitting on a dusty rock-cut shelf, was a rust-eaten tin box. A profound silence fell over them, broken only by their ragged breaths. This was it, the heart of the secret. Fanny reached into the darkness, her trembling fingers closing around the cold metal. She lifted the box out into the light. It was heavy. The lid was rusted shut, but Nathan managed to pry it open with the tip of his knife. The contents were not silver, nor gold, nor any treasure a miner would seek. The box was filled with paper. On top lay a thick, leather-bound ledger. Beneath it, a bundle of letters, tied with a faded piece of twine. Fanny lifted the ledger with reverent hands. She opened it. The first page was a title plate, the ink still dark and clear in the dry air. Official Survey of the Providence Valley, it read. Commissioned by the Territorial Office, 1848, Amos Albright, Certified Surveyor. Nathan let out a sharp, indrawn breath. Amos Albright, he whispered. He was a legend, the best there was. The story is he took a job out here and just vanished. Fanny turned the page. It was a map, exquisitely drawn, of the entire valley. And there, clearly marked with precise coordinates tied directly to the witness corner at the Silence Mine entrance, was her father's homestead. Plot 7, and next to it, Plot 8, Plot 9, Plot 10, a half-dozen other small homesteads, all legally registered, all their boundaries immutable and clear. It was the original, true survey of the valley. Then she picked up the letters. They were from Albright to his wife. Her hands shaking, she read the last one aloud. "My dearest Anna," it began, "I have uncovered a terrible fraud. The Sterling Cattle Company, through its agent, has bribed the land office and intends to file a false survey, erasing the claims of the settlers in the Northern Valley. They know I have the true plat. I have been threatened. I fear for my life. I have hidden the original ledger where they will never find it. I have sealed the evidence inside the mountain itself. If anything happens to me, the mountain will remember the truth." Fanny looked up at Nathan, her eyes wide with the enormity of their discovery. The silence mine wasn't a failed silver strike. It was a tomb for the truth. It had been sealed to bury the proof of a crime that had stolen the valley, piece by piece, for 30 years. Her father's deed wasn't a forgery. It was the last echo of a truth everyone had been forced to forget. The discovery of the ledger changed everything, but it also presented a new, more dangerous problem. They held the truth in their hands, but Elias Thorne and the Sterling Cattle Company held the valley in their fist. Presenting the ledger to the same corrupt clerk who had dismissed Fanny's deed would be suicide. The book would simply disappear, and so, perhaps, would they. They needed a plan, but before they could form one, the mountain made a decision of its own. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled over the peaks, and the temperature plummeted. An early, vicious autumn blizzard, the kind that could kill a man in an hour, was bearing down on them. "We need to get you to town," Nathan said urgently, already moving to gather his things. But it was too late. The first flakes, thick and wet, were already falling. The wind rose to a piercing shriek, and the world dissolved into a blinding vortex of white. They scrambled for the shelter of Fanny's lean-to, reinforcing it against the granite outcrop as the storm hit with full fury. They huddled together, the wind tearing at their small refuge, the ledger and letters wrapped safely in oilcloth between them. The world shrank to the small circle of their fire and the howling darkness beyond. Hours passed. The snow piled up in massive drifts, burying the landscape. Sometime deep in the night, over the roar of the wind, they heard a faint cry. A human sound. Nathan and Fanny exchanged a look. To go out in this was madness. To ignore it was unthinkable. Tying a rope around his waist and giving the other end to Fanny, Nathan ventured into the blizzard. He returned minutes later, half carrying a snow-caked figure. It was Elias Thorne. He was barely conscious, his face pale and his lips blue. His horse had thrown him, and his leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He had been checking on his cattle on the high range, caught by the storm's sudden violence. Without a word, Fanny moved aside, making room for him by the fire. She tore a strip from her own spare blanket to make a crude splint for his leg, her movements deft and sure. She brewed the last of her tea and forced the hot liquid between his chattering teeth. Thorne, delirious with pain and cold, looked up at her, his eyes struggling to focus. He saw the woman he had scorned, the woman he had driven from her home, now saving his life. "Why?" he croaked, the word a puff of frosted air. Fanny didn't answer. She just pulled another blanket over him, one of the two she owned. Nathan watched her, a look of profound admiration on his face. He had warned her earlier that day that a man like Thorne would never repay such a kindness. "I know," she had said simply. This act wasn't for Thorne. It was for herself. It was a quiet declaration. Her fight was not against a single, cruel man. It was for a principle. It was for the truth, and her humanity was not something she was willing to sacrifice to win. Sheltering her enemy in her meager camp, using her own scant resources to save him from the storm, she was committing fully to the person she was, the person her father had raised her to be. The ledger could prove she owned the land. But this act, in the heart of the blizzard, proved she deserved it. As the storm raged on, the three of them, the wronged, the witness, and the villain, were trapped together. A strange tableau of justice and mercy in the heart of the silent mountain. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was a pristine, silent wilderness of white. The snow was waist-deep, the air clean and bitingly cold. Thorn's fever had broken, but his leg was badly swollen. He was weak, humbled, and for the first time since Fanny had met him, utterly silent. His arrogance had been stripped away by the storm and her quiet, unhesitating compassion. Nathan, using makeshift snowshoes, made the arduous journey down to Providence Gulch for the doctor. He returned late the next day with Doc Abernathy, a kind, no-nonsense man who had tended to everyone in the valley for 40 years. The doctor examined Thorn's leg, setting the bone with practiced efficiency. "A nasty break," he said, "but you'll live. Thanks to Miss Marsh here." His eyes, full of a quiet intelligence, lingered on Fanny, then on the strange camp set up against a sealed mine. While he worked, Nathan laid the old ledger on a dry rock. "Doc," he said, "I think you need to see this." Abernathy wiped his hands and picked up the book. He opened it, his eyes scanning the title page. He went still. "Amos Albright," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "My God. I was just a boy, but I remember him. My father knew him. When he disappeared, everyone said he'd run off with the Survey Commission's money. The Sterling Company spread the story themselves." He turned the pages, his expression shifting from disbelief to dawning comprehension, and finally to a slow-burning anger. This changes everything." The journey back to town was a strange procession. Thorn was strapped to a litter dragged by Nathan's horse. Fanny rode Jedediah, the precious ledger held securely in her lap. When they arrived, word of Thorn's rescue and the reason for Nathan's journey had already begun to spread. People came out of their homes and businesses, not with whispers and averted eyes, but with open curiosity and a dawning respect. They saw Fanny Marsh, the woman they had dismissed, riding into town not as an outcast, but as a savior, carrying a truth that had been buried for 3 decades. At the county office, Doc Abernathy and Nathan presented the ledger to the sweating clerk. Faced with the unimpeachable evidence of the original plat, witnessed by the town's most respected doctor, the clerk's blustering defense of the Sterling deed crumbled. He unlocked a dusty cabinet and produced the official plat on file, a cruder, simpler map. It was a clear forgery. The news spread through the valley like a grass fire. Other families who had been forced to sell their land to the Sterling Company for pennies on the dollar over the years, who had been told their own deeds were flawed, began to appear. An old man came forward with a story of his father being threatened off his land. A widow spoke of a mysterious fire that had destroyed their barn just before they were forced to sell. Fanny's discovery hadn't just reclaimed her own home, it had given a voice to a generation of injustice. The Sterling Cattle Company, faced with a mountain of evidence and the collective fury of the valley, folded. Their lawyers sent word from Denver. They were withdrawing all claims based on the fraudulent survey and would offer financial restitution to the affected families. Elias Thorn was quietly recalled by the company, disappearing from Providence Gulch as suddenly as he had appeared, his public humiliation complete but private. The townspeople now looked at Fanny with a kind of reverence. She was no longer the Marsh girl. She was the woman who had listened to the mountain. The last rays of the autumn sun bathed the valley in a soft, golden light. Fanny stood on the porch of her father's cabin, her home, now indisputably hers. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the wood smoke curling from her chimney. The windows, which had been dark and empty for weeks, now glowed with the warm light of a lantern. She had come home. Nathan Vale stood beside her, leaning against a porch post. His work was done. The new old boundaries were being recorded, and the Sterling Company's fraudulent claims were being systematically dismantled. He could have left a week ago, but he had stayed. He looked out over the valley, a patchwork of gold and green stretching to the horizon. "It's a beautiful place," he said quietly. "Your father chose well." Fanny followed his gaze, but her eyes were drawn higher, toward the dark line of the mountains to the north, to the place where the Silence Mine lay hidden. She had no intention of reopening it. The silver within it was worthless compared to the truth it had guarded. It had served its purpose. It could rest now. "What will you do now?" Nathan asked, his voice gentle. The question hung in the peaceful air. She could sell. She could leave. She had been vindicated, and she was free. But as she looked at the fields her father had cleared, at the sturdy cabin he had built with his own 2 hands, she felt the deep, anchoring pull of roots. She had fought for a piece of paper, for a deed, for a legal right. But in the process, in the hardship and the discovery, she had found something more. She had found her place, not just on the map, but in the story of the valley itself. She finally turned her gaze from the mountain to the land before her, her land. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "My father left me a homestead," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening quiet. "But this valley, we earned that back together." Her words held the simple, profound weight of the story's moral. Inheritance wasn't just property passed down. It was a truth to be stewarded, a community to be restored. She had been cast out, only to find that in the wilderness, she had uncovered the very thing that would bring everyone home. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this incredible journey. This has been a story about the enduring power of hidden truths, and how the things and people a world dismisses often hold the key to its healing. If you were moved by Fanny's story, we'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of quiet courage and unexpected discovery. We'll be back soon with the story of an old blacksmith who was given a single, rusted key and told it would open a future he never knew he had.